picture? Is that okay?
Sure, okay. Little selfie action.
It's alive!
It's alive! Alive!
What was that?
How much do you really know about the mad scientist and his creation? Frankenstein is a story that's been told again and again. Some of those versions good, but a lot of them pretty bad. I've picked out some of the worst to watch with you today, and they're pretty interesting. They include things like alien babes in fur bikinis and Bat Thumb. That's right, you heard me, Bat Thumb. But for a bit of a palate cleanser, we'll also be breaking down a couple of actually good adaptations in between, and maybe even talking about a bit of the history of Frankenstein for those of you who are interested. Don't worry, I'm including timestamps for those of you who are just here for the bad movies. Before we get started, don't forget to hit that red subscribe button so you can join me next time. I'm gonna be breaking down some more mythical beasts and monsters, and the next video is gonna be all about the movie figure of the Mummy. So if you're a fan of freaks like me, then you're gonna want to see what's coming next. But for now, let's get back to Mary Shelley's story. It was a perfect storm that created this monster, both literally and figuratively speaking. The year 1815 was known as the year without a summer, when a volcanic eruption in Indonesia forced this eerie darkness over the world. This was the summer that 18-year-old Mary Shelley went on holiday in Lake Geneva, Switzerland, with her husband, Percy Bysshe Shelley, their friend, Lord Byron, and the physician John Polidori. Now, pretty much all of our friends here were established writers in one form or another. Plus, there just wasn't a whole lot that they could do while on vacation, thanks to the world's largest known volcanic eruption in history making the weather so blocky. So to keep themselves entertained, they decided to read from a collection of ghost stories. And that was the night that Lord Byron challenged the group to write a ghost story of their own. Mary based her story off of a dream she'd recently had, most likely about a loved one coming back to life, seeing as her young life had been pretty tragic up to that point. Mary's mother was the famed Mary Wollstonecraft, writer of the 1792 A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, but Mary's mother passed away when she was only a month old. And since her stepmother wasn't all that interested in educating her, the young girl gave herself an education by reading at her mother's gravesite. When she was 16, Mary had been disowned by her family because of her relationship with Percy. And she'd lost not only 2 babies, but her own half-sister right before going on holiday. Talk about a deserved vacation. You can see why death was on her mind, and the story that Mary wrote confronted the subject of death head on. Even Lord Byron had to admit it was a wonderful work for a girl, and Mary would have it published 2 years later in 1818. Now, there are a few things about the book I want to establish before we move on. For one thing, it's not made entirely clear that lightning is the thing that brings the creature back to life in the book. Victor doesn't actually tell us how he did it in the book because he doesn't want any of us readers, actually going out and bringing any dead back to life or anything. Which is just kind of selfish if you ask me. But it is mentioned that he uses some sort of chemical and a mysterious spark to animate him, so do with that what you will. This was most likely inspired by Giovanni Aldini's attempts to reanimate a convicted murderer using electricity in 1780. It's truly an insane experiment. We don't have time to get into it right now, but yeah, look that one up. Not only does the monster talk in the book, but he's pretty intelligent and philosophical as well. He's extremely concerned about the meaning of his own existence, especially considering in the book he was abandoned by his father the moment he was born and left to navigate the world by his own devices. Something that Mary could probably relate to if we're being honest here. The monster is tormented by loneliness in the book, and he asks Victor to build him a bride exactly like him. But when Victor takes a look at the creature that he's already made, he can't bring himself to damn another person to that sort of existence, so he destroys the bride. The monster returns the favor and kills Victor's wife, trapping the two of them in this endless struggle where they're constantly chasing each other to the ends of the earth, or until one or both of them dies. Most likely Victor. But my point is, the bride doesn't actually come to life in the book, which is a little disappointing, I will admit. Also, the creature's name is Adam. Sort of. Many readers have long assumed his name is Adam because the monster does actually refer to himself by this name multiple times, but only ever in the third person. Remember that I am thy creature. I ought to be thy Adam, but I am rather the fallen. Like Adam, I was apparently united by no link to any other being. I remembered Adam's supplication to his creator, but where was mine? It's also rumored that Mary said in an interview that if the creature had a name, it would be Adam. Although that isn't like gospel or anything. Clearly, since so few of the movies use it. And speaking of movies, let's talk about that first one. Love it or hate it, Mary Shelley's book has stuck around because of this movie. It established a lot of the most Frankenstein-y things that we tend to associate with the character. Boris Karloff's monster lacks the eloquence of his book counterpart, but he's not a monster. There's a better way I could have worded that. What I mean is, he's not mean. He's a sensitive and caring soul who just so happens to be in the body of an 8-foot-tall patchwork zombie. The movie is much more interested in exploring how we perceive monsters than in how monsters perceive themselves. And because of that, there's a lot more focus on how the creature is rejected by society than there was in the book. That isn't to say that it wasn't a theme in the book, but there the monster's biggest rejection came from Victor, rather than a full-on angry mob. Victor in the book works alone, but this movie gives him an assistant named Fritz who sort of bungles the whole experiment by stealing the brain of a criminal and later chasing the monster away. This is the character who would later become known as Igor in the 1939 Son of Frankenstein, where he was played by famous Dracula actor Bela Lugosi. The movie also establishes the trope of the monster being brought to life with lightning, and Victor doesn't reject the monster when he makes him.
Now I know what it feels like to be God.
Did you know that that line was so controversial when the movie came out, it was removed by censors in the late 1930s, and wasn't restored to its full glory until the 1980s? Makeup artist Jack P. Pierce came up with the monster's design, from his ill-fitting suit, the bolts in his neck, the droopy eyelids, and his flat head, none of which is true to the book. There, Victor is horrified by how his creature turns out, partly because he had selected his features as beautiful. And while we're on the subject of Victor, his name was changed to Henry for the film because the name Victor was deemed too severe and unfriendly for an American audience. Americans. The Bride doesn't even feature in until the sequel, where Victor/Henry has absolutely no problem doing it all over again.
She's alive! Alive!
It makes sense though, to some degree. It's a movie, so of course we want some good visuals. And what better visual is there than the king and queen of horror? Elsa Lanchester was only 5'4", but with her stilts she stood at a whopping 7 feet. Her hair was held in place using a wired horsehair cage, and her bandages were wrapped so tightly that she could barely move. She had to be carried around the studio and fed through a straw. There's even one story that claims one of her stand-ins went into a screaming fit from the claustrophobia. Colin Clive, who portrayed Henry Frankenstein in both movies, was actually struggling with some pretty serious alcoholism at the time, and his mental state had gotten way worse between the two filming periods. It was apparently so bad, his co-stars would often see him napping on set, and there would be times when he'd need to be held upright for some simple over-the-shoulder shots. Only 2 years later, Clive would die as a result of complications from tuberculosis when he was only 37 years old. It really is a miracle that this movie turned out as great as it did when you consider everything that was going on behind the scenes, although the ending did always sort of irk me. The bride rejects the monster, and he does not handle it well.
We belong dead.
The Hays Code at the time demanded that all Hollywood productions have the villains and monsters punished by the end, so I realized that the writers only had a certain amount of freedom when it came to how the movie could end. But it still leaves you with this dissatisfied feeling overall. Who doesn't want to see a version of the story where the bride and monster live happily ever after with their 2.5 patchwork children? But whatever, the scriptwriters were already having enough trouble working under the Hays Code, and I'm sure they would have made a much better movie if they were working nowadays. And has anyone yet? So I don't really know if horror is the best name for this category so much as gothic drama. All of these movies do have horror elements to them, but they also have a very specific feel to them. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is among the more book-accurate movies out there. Robert De Niro is given a beautiful performance as the creature, but the movie is just tonally all over the place, which makes it sort of hard to sit through. The 2015 movie, Victor Frankenstein, is more of a reimagining of the Boris Karloff movie, but it has an interesting approach just by making Igor more essential to the project. There are some pretty cringe scenes, like the moment when Daniel Radcliffe has his hump removed is not only gross, but really weird. I feel like Igor is associated with the hump almost more than anything, and the movie would have been stronger if they'd actually found an actor who had one, let's be real. But James McAvoy is given a brilliant performance as a manic genius who you genuinely want to get behind. Even though, if you do, you'll find yourself drowning in a pile of human body parts before long. The creature in this version is actually Victor's brother Henry, who he's become obsessed with bringing back, and I have to admit that I enjoy the little callback in the name. Victor turns on the monster shortly after bringing him to life, but after that Henry just sort of rampages and dies, so there's not too much to say about him. It's not a perfect movie, but I've been biased towards James McAvoy ever since.
He's not well.
And if you want a super strong movie, but you don't particularly care whether or not it's a direct adaptation, I definitely recommend checking out the 1973 film Spirit of the Beehive. It uses the story of Frankenstein to some really creative means, turning the monster into a comfort to lonely and troubled children. It's truly a beautiful story, and even inspired the likes of Guillermo del Toro. But unfortunately, I promised you guys some bad movies, so here we are. Hey, have you ever wanted a version of Frankenstein that was mostly about Neanderthals for some reason? Literally everything about this movie is a mess, right down to the production details. We're not even sure who may have directed it. Nobody's owned up to it, and there are like 5 different people who may have done it. Not that any of that matters, the problems with this movie are clear from minute 1. See if you notice anything strange about this opening. I didn't edit that. That's literally how the movie starts. They just throw you right into the action with absolutely no care to whether or not you know what's going on. So anyway, Frankenstein's Castle of Freaks takes place in a regular Victorian town that just so happens to have a cave full of Neanderthals on its outskirts. One of the Neanderthals wanders into town one day, and an angry mob immediately beats him to death. Dr. Frankenstein just so happens to be passing by, and he takes the Neanderthal's body back to do what Frankensteins do. But because it's the 1970s and we've got to work some nudity into the film somehow, Dr. Frankenstein's daughter pays a visit and brings along a friend for Victor to mac on. Why are they dressed like they're part of Boy George's entourage? Topical reference, Sierra. Great job passing for human there. But oh no, Victor's girlfriend is kidnapped by another Neanderthal. The townspeople blame it on the monster and band together to kill him, even though the girlfriend lady tries to stick up for him. The movie ends on this dramatic note, like, I guess we're all sort of monsters in the end. I get the idea of making the monster a Neanderthal may have been to make him the literal bridge between human and animal, but it's just so weird and so removed from the version of the monster from the book that I can't help but wonder what Mary Shelley would have thought about it. Her monster was intelligent while Boris Karloff's was kind, but both of these monsters highlight his innocence against a harsh world. We don't know anything about this monster besides the fact that he's a Neanderthal, and the only other Neanderthal in this movie kidnaps a woman caveman style. It's not the most endearing of takes is what I'm saying. Although I will say that his eyebrows look like mine when I haven't plucked in a little while. End of day, this movie is just so slow and meandering, it's not even worth it for the laughs. But if you want a version of Frankenstein for that, I have a couple of suggestions. The original Frankenstein isn't all that funny, but the best comedy versions aren't making fun of the story. 1974's Young Frankenstein,
It's pronounced Frankenstein,
is mostly a parody of overdramatic monster movies from the era, and that's a big part of the reason why it works. It's a loving tribute to Karloff's movie, and Gene Wilder is really giving it his all here.
Give my creation life!
One of the first comedy adaptations was 1948's Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, and already you can see how the monster was starting to lose his edge. It didn't take long for monster movies to begin seeming silly, and Frankenstein's monster has never been the most threatening of bad guys. There was a shift in how we saw him very quick, and he began to seem almost, dare I say it, innocent. And then we have comedies like Frankenhooker, which I have to mention, because how could I not?
Want a date?
Frankenhooker's great, because it leans into that whole being made out of all of the most beautiful parts bit from the book. Except Jeffrey Franken in this movie is straight, so he makes the monster a woman. You can already tell the sort of movie it is from the title alone. It's just silly fun and so over the top that it's definitely worth a watch if you're into that sort of thing. No judgment, I am. What I'm not into is Frankenstein's Island. This movie is nonsense. I don't even know why they put Frankenstein in the title, because this movie is just barely about Frankenstein. Frankenstein's Island is actually about a group of competitive hot air balloonists who crash land on a mysterious island that, at first, seems to be peopled exclusively by women in matching fur bikinis. Seriously, not even a variation in cut or style or...
This reminds me of Quail Gardens in Philly. Oh!
Did he just get Bruce Campbelled? Yeah, that's never explained, and it happens a few times. Close hugging seems to help. Anyway, the competitive hot air balloonists, because that's totally a thing, shut up, began to suspect that the women may be witches because they do things like wear snakes as bracelets and stare at themselves in the mirror. What sort of person does that? All I want to do is get together with my girls and dance like this in the woods. Is that too much to ask? Anyway, the men sneak away and find themselves in the home of Sheila Frankenstein, Victor's descendant, whose married name is Van Helsing because if movies have taught me anything, it's that Dracula and Frankenstein definitely exist in the same universe, despite one of them being science fiction and the other one being fantasy. And yes, you heard me right. We're following Dr. Frankenstein's descendant this time. Victor himself appears as the floating head of John Carradine, repeating the same two words over and over again.
The power! The power!
That's a thing. But otherwise, we're stuck with Dr. Van Helsing, whose husband is dying from being over 200 years old and uses blood somehow to keep living. It's not very well explained, but what we do find out is that the women in fur bikinis are actually the last remaining descendants of an advanced alien race. I think it makes sense if you watch Ancient Aliens. So Sheila Frankenstein finds out that one of our balloonists is also a doctor. Very versatile, these balloonists. So she brainwashes him to save her husband. You'd think she'd be qualified to do that as Victor Frankenstein's descendant, but I guess vampirism and brainwashing is more obvious than using her ancestors' research notes. To be fair, the reason why they say she can't use her ancestors' formula is because Frankenstein's monster was a bit of a savage beast when her ancestor brought him back the first time around, and Sheila doesn't want that happening to her husband. So instead, they kidnap one of the alien girls to drain her blood for Van Helsing. But that was going way too far, man. The remaining balloonists team up with the alien babes to get their friends back, and somehow Frankenstein's monster becomes involved, and it is hilarious. Just look at this. Then the balloonists just run off into the woods with their dog. What happened to the Frankensteins? The monster? The alien babes? Who knows? I like to imagine that they're stuck in that ridiculous looking fight for the rest of time, like some sort of more torturous version of Groundhog's Day. It's a shame that this movie is such a suckfest because I actually don't hate the idea of a more feminine monster. Do we have any better examples of that? So I'm sort of collapsing two categories into one with this one. Frankenstein movies that use a more feminine perspective, and Frankenstein movies that use a queer perspective. I felt like these two subjects were sort of related when it came to Frankenstein, and I know that you can make the argument that Frankenhooker actually belonged here, but I mean, come on. We all know that movie was made by and for straight dudes.
Want a date? You going out?
Rocky Horror Picture Show is probably the first movie you thought of when this category came up.
I'm just a sweet transvestite.
Written by Richard O'Brien, that guy if you didn't know.
Hello.
And inspired mostly by his love of science fiction and B-movies growing up, it follows the adventures of alien scientist Dr. Frankenfurter as he tries to build the perfect man and sleeps his way through the population of Earth while doing it.
It's not easy having a good time.
Again, it's leaning into that whole bit from the book where Victor was actively trying to build the most beautiful man possible, something that many readers have interpreted as a sign of Victor's queerness. Mary Shelley was living during a time when terms like bisexual and pansexual weren't really a thing, but it may be worth mentioning that when she and her husband were on vacation with Lord Byron, he, at the time, was trying to escape from England due to a number of sexual scandals involving both men and women. Mary herself is believed to have had a love affair with Jane Williams after her husband passed away. And we know that she helped two friends, Isabel Robinson and Mary Diana Dodds, obtain fake passports so that they could run away to Paris and live as man and wife. So yeah, it's safe to assume that she was at least an ally. Even the original version of Bride of Frankenstein included the line, "We are all three infidels, scoffers at all marriage ties, believing only in living freely and fully," in reference to Mary and her friends. But of course, that line was cut by censors. But it's no surprise that these original movies had a queer presence, considering director James Whale was one of the few out and proud people working in Hollywood at the time. Even Colin Clive is rumored to have been bisexual, and it's believed that his struggles with alcoholism were directly related to his inability to come to terms with his attraction to men. Which, I mean, same. Attraction to men has also led me to drink, though perhaps for different reasons. Not to make light of his situation at all, but I mean, come on. It's just such a sad thing. You gotta lighten the mood with something. There were so many queer people working behind the scenes of these films that it came as no surprise that the monster was made so sympathetic. That's sort of a trope when it comes to works produced by queer writers. If you need proof, just look at my entire channel. And a lot of queer works really blur the line between hero and villain. 2002's May is a haunting look into one lonely, mentally ill woman's mind as she tries to cope with dating for the first time as a bisexual woman. We see how she grows fixated on a physical detail of every person she's dating. His hands, her legs, things like that. And when she puts together her monster, it's to serve as the only companion she thinks she can have after every other relationship has failed, and she builds it out of parts of people of both genders. It's an interesting character study for sure, a tragic look into the twisted extents some people will go to cure their own loneliness, especially when they already feel incurably different from everyone else. That's definitely a feeling I can relate to, more when I was younger. I'm queer and neurodivergent and all that good stuff, and sort of like May, I didn't start dating until I was well into my mid-20s. So I think it's incredibly important that anyone who does feel that way knows that they're not alone. There are people like you, they're just harder to find. You're special, there's nothing wrong with that. And someday, someone just as special as you will see your specialness. Just don't give up hope is all I'm saying. And in the meantime, just don't let the normies get you down. But May gives us a mad scientist who's a woman. What about an actual female monster? Who isn't Frankenhooker, I mean. Patchwork doesn't have any queer characters, unfortunately, but it definitely passes the Bechdel test. After a party, Jennifer wakes up to find herself sharing a body with Ellie and Madeline, and the three of them need to work together to find out what happened to them and get revenge. There's definitely a girl power aspect to the movie, but it takes a lot of influence from directors like Stuart Gordon, and the gimmick of having three active minds in one body is just too good. Honestly, all three of these movies just go to prove how much better independent movies can be than the typical Hollywood tripe we have coming next. Out of all the movies we've discussed so far, this one is easily the worst. At least Frankenstein's Island and Frankenstein's Castle of Freaks actually made me laugh or feel something. Besides anger, I, Frankenstein is a sort of sequel to the book, picking up right where the story left off, which is very jarring because they just sort of expect you to already know what happened, but there's been so many versions of the story by this point that you just sort of have to pick it up as you go along. Plus, they're clearly more influenced by the book than the Boris Karloff movie, seeing as the monster hates Victor Frankenstein and he spent the last few years of his life trying to hunt him down and kill him. Which he successfully does at the beginning of the movie, but he never has an emotional reaction to it. You'd think that would be a big deal for him, succeeding in his life's mission of destroying his own creator and all, but no, just an average Tuesday for the monster, I guess. Or Adam, as he's called in this movie. Not by his own choice like in the book, but because this gargoyle lady said so. Yeah, there are gargoyles in this movie. After Adam kills Frankenstein, the whole thing goes completely off the rails, and we suddenly get into angel and demon lore. These gargoyles are a secret order of guardians protecting mankind. I hate the design of the monsters in this movie because they made absolutely no attempt to make the gargoyles look likable, which would be fine if they had personalities at all likable, but instead we're just stuck with these boring planks of wood walking around in the most hideous CGI bodies ever. Adam is played by Aaron Eckhart, who looks just like Aaron Eckhart with maybe a little bit of scarring. His isolation was supposed to be more socially based than appearance-based in this movie, which I have complicated feelings about. On the one hand, that definitely is more accurate to the book, but at the same time, I'm just so sick of seeing supermodels play traditionally unattractive characters. This movie came out around the same time as Beastly and the 2013 remake to Carrie, both of which are guilty of doing the same thing, and arguably worse. Like, the Beast used to be a lion man in the 80s, you guys. You didn't think to apply a bit of fake fur? But my point is, this entire casting choice in I, Frankenstein just reeks of Hollywood trying to shove more eye candy into a movie that doesn't need it. And I'm already so sick of that. The demons all want Adam because they can only possess someone if they don't have a soul, which just seems like a weird bit of demon lore to me. Like, how many people are walking around without souls? It has to be more than Adam if demonic possessions have happened before, but then why are all the demons so crazy about him if he's not special because of the whole resurrection thing? Are you implying that the little girl from The Exorcist didn't have a soul? Or are you saying that she died and was brought back to life by a mad scientist before the events of the movie? I'm so confused. But it's okay, because we find out that Adam did have a soul after all. It's not like he gains one or does anything for it, he just had one all along. Happy endings for everyone. Well, except for Victor Frankenstein, I guess, who's still dead, but Adam very mildly doesn't hate him anymore. Isn't that sweet? Honestly, the movie that this reminds me of more than anything is Queen of the Damned. Just a little too angsty, and it's definitely telling more than one story here. I, Frankenstein was originally supposed to be brought into the universe of the Underworld franchise, and it definitely fits in a lot better there than as a straight-up Frankenstein movie. The movie bombed in theaters, and audiences just sort of moved on, making us all feel yet again that Frankenstein may be more of a monster for kids these days. You know how I said that Frankenstein seems almost innocent nowadays? Well, this is like the pinnacle of that. Like, the most innocent that Frankenstein's monster can get. Tim Burton has directed 2 versions of Frankenweenie over the years, an animated movie from 2012 and a live-action short from 1984. The live-action version is the better one between the two. The story is just so tight and compact, following a boy who loses his dog and uses the miracle of science and movie know-how to bring him back. The idea of turning a dog into Frankenstein's monster is just such a great one too. You really get the sense that he's just being a dog while everyone around him responds poorly because he looks strange. In the same way that the monster in all versions is just trying to be a person no matter how he looks or the circumstances of his birth. The animated version definitely jumps the shark at a certain point by having all the local town's children try to bring back their dead pets, but something goes wrong and it winds up turning them all into monsters.
Mr. Whiskers?
I will leave behind the human world to raise Mr. Whiskers as my son in the woods.
My problem bigger.
I will also raise Shelley in the woods with Mr. Whiskers. You can keep the zombie sea monkeys though, those are terrifying. It's silly, but it's all pretty mindless fun. Igor reminds me of a more child-friendly version of Victor Frankenstein, in the sense that it turns Igor into the real scientist and the doctor into a bumbling idiot who needs his help. The monster in this version is a woman who's far too sweet and innocent to act like the real monster Igor expects her to be. It's about learning to accept people for who they are and looking past appearances and all that jazz. Plus, the moment near the end when a giant Shirley Temple-looking zombie destroys monsters while singing show tunes will be with me for the rest of my life. Thank you very much.
Tell me.
And now we're getting to the monster movies that are just sort of a love letter to the monster movies of yesteryear. In the movie Monster Squad, Frankenstein's monster almost serves as a sort of hero, protecting our group of children from Dracula and the Wolfman. And in Hotel Transylvania, the monster is almost the friendliest of all the monsters. He's the one who rallies the crowd to help find Dracula's daughter at the end of the first movie, and he's among the more open-minded when it comes to opening up the hotel for humans. I also need to mention my first introduction to Frankenstein's monster as a kid, which was Alvin and the Chipmunks Meet Frankenstein. Theodore drops his teddy bear at a theme park, and the monster follows them home so he can return it to him. I was genuinely shocked to find out that the monster killed an innocent woman in the book. I associate him with being very concerned that the cutest chipmunk has his teddy back. And that's the common theme with all of these best movies. The monster's never the bad guy. He may go on a rampage and do what monsters do, but end of day, it's our reaction to him that's going to decide who he is. And then we have something like Franken-Thumb. I need to know how many of you have actually heard of the Thumb movies before today. They were a strange little series of spoof movies made by Steve Oderkirk, the director of Ace Ventura: When Nature Calls. And yes, every single one of them had this annoying orange editing style, and every single one of them stars actual human thumbs. The first movie, Thumb Wars: The Phantom Cuticle, was released in 1999. And over the following years, they would release classics like The God Thumb, Bat Thumb, and Thumbtanic. There's even the upcoming Thumb Wars: The Thighs of Sky Skipper, which is going to be a parody of Star Wars: The Rise of Skywalker. As you can probably tell by just how many of them there are, these movies definitely have their fans, but something tells me it's not the quality earning them a cult following. Franken-Thumb is a perfect example of the kind of insanity you'll find in one of these movies. It opens up with a classic movie-style introduction, and right away you can see the level of high wit we're in for.
I have just wet myself, and now must go.
Now, I'm going to pose to you an age-old question. Are the Thumb movies funny? Some people would say that they're painfully unfunny, but others feel like you just kind of have to laugh, maybe because it really does feel like a child's first attempt at making a movie. But anyway, we cut to a graveyard where we see Dr. Franken-Thumb and Igor digging up body parts.
Open it, Humpy, open it!
Wait, what did he just call him?
Yes, Humpy, yes!
No, that's not his name, is it?
But we lack a brain, Humpy.
Okay, so Dr. Franken-Thumb and Humpy find what they're looking for, leading to what is unironically the best joke in the entire movie.
He'll do just fine. We'll use his bum cheeks.
If I do have one good thing to say about this movie, it's that the Doctor is actually pretty great.
That I, Dr. Franken-Thumb, have got it seriously going on.
I'm just a sweet transvestite.
I also think it's not a bad idea for a spoof movie to have the experiment fail the first time around. I've never seen that done before, and it seems like such an easy way to play with the audience's expectations. But every second of this thing is filled with so much noise, it's just exhausting to watch. And when the monster actually is brought to life, he immediately starts beating Humpy so savagely it actually starts to get uncomfortable.
Oh, Humpy, please don't spoil the moment.
I feel like someone put a laugh track on the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. But wait, guess what the monster's name is in this version?
We shall call him Pepper, because he really spiced up our lives.
Why didn't Iron Man ever use that line?
I want one.
No.
And then he immediately goes back to beating Humpy. Seriously, I'm surprised this guy's not dead yet. Pepper is actually pretty unlikable in this movie. I know it's a spoof, but young Frankenstein still managed to give us a monster who is both exaggerated and endearing. Pepper, on the other hand, crushes cute puppies between his hands for fun. And cute kittens. And a bunny. And 2 birds. You know what? This scene just goes on for way too long. Eventually, the Doctor comes around to lock in Pepper up. But Humpy chases Pepper off with a torch, just so that Pepper can introduce us to the worst character in the movie.
You are being careful now, okay?
Daddy, are you Italian?
Yes!
I hope you like that fake accent because you'll be listening to it for the rest of the movie. He never stops talking. Eventually, Pepper does what we all wish we could do and knocks him down to the ground. But he does it accidentally, which really makes me wonder why the movie went out of its way to tell us that he was aggressive, just to have it be a misunderstanding that turns the townspeople against him. At least Frankenstein's Castle of Freaks was consistent in making the monster the bad guy. This movie wants to make the monster scary, but also have you feel bad for him in the end. But he already squashed a guinea pig, dude. Dr. Franken-Thumb decides that the only way to stop an angry mob is to make a second monster. But instead of giving us the bride, we get something even more amazing.
Franken-Bat-Thumb!
Why does Bat Thumb sound like Sylvester Stallone? I think this version of Batman might actually be able to solve a riddle without Robin's help. But anyway, Bat Thumb saves the day, and the movie ends the same way it ran. With Pepper beating Humpy, the doctor laughing maniacally, Bat Thumb slurring incoherently, and the Italian guy giving us one last Italian stereotype.
Let's all go have some mortadella!
And that was the movie. The Thumb movies are available on YouTube if you want to witness them for yourself. Okay, so I've watched a lot of Frankenstein movies for this video, and before this, I was pretty much a Frankenstein snob. You know, I thought the book was the only legitimately good version, and maybe Rocky Horror Picture Show, but honestly, I had a hard time getting behind a version of the monster that was just sort of animalistic and silent. This experience has really brought me around, just by showing me that that version of the monster can be done really well, like in the original black and white movie. Or it can be done like Franken-Thumb. Which Frankenstein adaptation do you think is the worst? Doesn't have to be one that we mentioned here today. If you've got something worse, I'm down for the headache. Thanks for joining me tonight, my friends, and remember, you have less to fear from the shadows than from your average pitchfork-wielding mob. Pleasant dreams! Special thanks to my supporter on Patreon, Wilson L. Ricks III. If you'd like to become a part of our little monster squad, just know that everybody's welcome. Hitting that subscribe button is a surefire way to become a member, but the Patreon link is there in the video description if you'd like to receive some bonus perks along the way. Things like early access to videos and scripts, and your name called out at the end. Until next time, my friends.